was done for Lamp, and that would be over 5 years ago. It was 1 month before the election of 2016. And so since my commitment is to do it the same, exactly the way it was, because it has nothing to do with this year, it was all done 4 or 5 years ago. And so that's pretty well what I will try to honor. But as we have a few more people coming in, I'm going to ask the folks that are here to join me in giving a round of applause to Vicki Yanis, who helps put all this together. She's back there in the back, and she's the one who makes it work. And if I know how to push the buttons right, there will be some slides toward the end of my remark, and I've never used them before because I thought I'd break my neck doing them, but Vicki's got it set up, and she's coached me, and Lord willing, I'll make it work. And so for the few that have come in later, I'm going to go ahead and introduce it the way that I was telling someone a moment ago. That I said if I were more technologically adept, as people were gathering, I would have Elvis Presley up here singing and gyrating to Fools Rush In Where Angels Fear to Tread, to even dare to talk about this subject. But they were prepared for Lamp presentation in 2016 before the presidential election. And any sane person would probably say no way, but this is a fool that plunged in then and doing it again. And I have to give some background. My mentor for constitutional law, some of you know, many of you may know very well, was Charles Allen Wright. He was an extremely, very conservative Republican, and Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who was considered one of the more liberal members of the United States Supreme Court, she described Charlie, and this is her quotation, a colossus standing at the summit of our profession. He was considered by both Republicans and Democrats as one of the great constitutional scholars. Leonard Garnett, who was President Nixon's general counsel, summoned Charles Allen Wright to be asked if he would be the special legal consultant to the White House for help on the constitutional issues involving Watergate. Charlie did not hesitate to accept that assignment, and this is how he explained why he took on what many thought was a thankless task. He said, I believe in the presidency, in the president, and I believe in the presidency. And so that's why I'm in this case. That's why he went to the White House. 10 years before, in 1964, in an interview, this lifelong conservative Republican explained his reluctant vote against Senator Barry Goldwater, the Republican candidate for president. And these are Charlie's words. I could vote for a candidate who is skeptical about the United Nations, critical of Social Security, against Medicare and federal aid to education, and even in favor of selling the Tennessee Valley Authority. But he went on to say, I cannot vote for a candidate whose election would be regarded as a mandate to slow down on civil rights and take a harder, more dangerous line on foreign relations. Accordingly, I will vote for Lyndon B. Johnson. That was a shock to many people. Charles Allen Wright was my mentor. In his third year at the University of Texas Law School, he named me to be his quizmaster, or by today's terms, his research assistant. At his direction, I did original research on his contribution to a monumental redo of the 54-volume treatise on federal practice and procedure, which is used all over the country. And he's the one who did a major piece of work on it. So most of what I will share with you this evening is shaped by Charlie's teaching and by a book of required reading for that long ago course. And the book was entitled 9 Men, A Political History of the Supreme Court from 1790 to 1955. And it was written by Charlie's mentor, who at the Yale Law School, his name was Fred Rodell. So this assignment, which I agreed to do for LAMP, has taken on an absolutely fabulous journey to better understand the United States Supreme Court, and for me personally to understand my own life. Fred Rodell's constitutional law mentor at Yale, so you have Rodell teaches Shirley Wright. Who taught Chuck Rodell? It was William O. Douglas, who at the age of 40 was appointed to the United States Supreme Court, where he served for 36 years, 209 days, the longest term in the history of the court. Out of a class of 120, Charlie assigned 9 of us to study and be prepared to represent the 9 justices to whom he assigned us. He named me to play the role of William O. Douglas. I read every book Douglas had written up to that time, and I read most of his court opinions. In many ways, this presentation is my way of saying thank you to Charles Allen Wright for directing my life when I was not even aware that he was doing it. So let me begin, as any lawyer should begin. May it please the court. Fred Rodell opened his classic book with this paragraph. At the top levels of the 3 branches of the civilian government of the United States sit the Congress, the President plus his cabinet, and the Supreme Court. Of these 3, in this unmilitary, unclerical nation, only one wears a uniform. Only one carries on its most important business in utter secret behind locked doors, and indeed never reports, even after death, what really went on there. Only one. Its members holding office for life if they choose. It's completely irresponsible to anyone or anything but themselves and their own consciences. Under our otherwise democratic form of government, only one top ruling group uses ceremony and secrecy, robes and ritual as instruments of the official policy, as wellsprings of its power. The 9 men who are the Supreme Court, and I remind you this was 1958 of the United States, are at once the most powerful and the most irresponsible of all the men in the world who govern other men. You may think this characterization is too critical, but here are 2 observations by the New York Times review of Jeffrey Toobin's 2007 book, which is called The 9, Inside the Secret World of the Supreme Court, explaining how difficult it is to be a reporter covering the Supreme Court. And these are Toobin's words, and this is the reviewer's words. Try to imagine any branch of government, the White House or the State Department, covered solely on the basis of public events and printed releases with nothing about its inner workings. It's inconceivable. But that's essentially how it is to cover the Supreme Court. Getting into the court's internal operations and culture is nearly impossible. Examining the justice critically, grading the quality and propriety and intellectual honesty of their work is dangerous. Details about the drama, the passion, and the pettiness of the place, about the way it works, which is our work, the people's work, emerge only years later, after the fact. So let me just give you a look at the court. To understand the demographics of the Supreme Court of the United States, we must consider the gender, ethnicity, religion, geography, economic backgrounds of, at that time, 112 people who had been appointed as justices. Constitutional scholars have examined all of these characteristics since the court was established in 1789, when there were only 6 justices. For its first 180 years, the justices were almost always white, male Protestants. Prior to the 20th century, a few Roman Catholics had been appointed, but the concern about diversity on the court was more about geography. It was more important to represent all regions of the country rather than to consider ethnic, religious, or gender diversity. The 20th century saw the appointment of a Jewish justice, Louis Brandeis, in 1916, an African American, Thurgood Marshall, 1967, an Italian American, Antonio Scalia, 1986, and finally, a woman, Sandra Day O'Connor, 1981. And I should point out that Sandra Day O'Connor's appointment was 26 years after Fred Rodell ended his analysis of 9 men in 1955. We weren't moving too fast. The 21st century saw the first appointment of a Hispanic justice, Sonia Sotomayor, in 2009. In spite of the interest of the court's demographics and the symbolism accompanying the inevitable political appointment process, gender, race, educational background, or religious views of the justices has played little role in their jurisprudence. For example, the opinions of the two African American justices, Thurgood Marshall and Clarence Thomas, have reflected radically different judicial philosophies. Rarely have they agreed, would they have agreed. William Brennan and Antonio Scalia shared a Catholic faith and a Harvard Law School education, but they shared little in the way of jurisprudence philosophies. The court's first two female justices, O'Connor and Ginsburg, voted together no more often than their male colleagues. This is far too much detail for a short presentation, but here are a few observations. Herbert Hoover, when he appointed Cardozo, a Sephardic Jew, who was more he was more concerned about having 3 New York justices than he was about having 2 Jewish justices. Richard Nixon attempted to employ the Southern strategy, hoping to secure support from Southern states by nominating judges from the South. He unsuccessfully nominated 2 different Southerners, Clinton Haynesworth of South Carolina and G.R. Carswell of Georgia, and neither one of them were appointed before he finally succeeded with the nomination of Henry Blackmun from Minnesota, so he was not able to appoint the Southern. As of 2014, the court has a majority from the northeastern United States. At that time, 7 justices from states in the north and east of Washington, 7 of the 9, including 4 justices born and raised in New York City. The remaining 2 justices come from Georgia and California, and that would be Thomas and Kennedy. Jeffrey Toobin, in his 2007 book, seeks to plumb the court's deepest mystery. And that is, why in the world is the Tribune, so dominated by Republicans, not shifted more radically rightward? At the time of Toobin's book, there had been only 2 Democratic nominees. And think about this. At the time of Toobin's book in 2007, there had been only 2 Democratic nominees in the last 40 years. It's something most people don't remember. Since that time, President Obama has made 2 appointments, Sotomayor and Elena Kagan. Just prior to the election, there was an election article on the dilemma that Chief Justice Roberts would have faced if Hillary Clinton had won and appointed justices that leaned her way politically. Would Roberts have shifted to the moderate middle, or would he become a dissenter, as Chief Justice Rehnquist did when the political persuasion of the court shifted to the left. If the Chief Justice, and this is a technical question, but it tells you an awful lot about the court. If the Chief Justice is in the majority, he can determine who writes the opinion. But if he's in the minority, the senior judge of the majority determines who writes the opinion. And most Chief Justices want to preserve the prerogative of determining who gets to write those opinions. Prior to the death of Judge Scalia, what was once an all-Protestant court was composed of 6 of the Roman Catholic faith and 3 who were from Judaism, Ginsburg, Breyer, and Kagan. There was not a single Protestant on the court. At one time, they were all Protestants, and then there was not a Protestant. Prior to Judge Scalia's death, 5 judges had law degrees from Harvard, 3 from Yale, and 1 from Columbia. Most scholars agree with Jeffrey Toobin's observation that Sandra Day O'Connor, and this is Toobin's quote, "She is the justice who, through her pragmatic, seat-of-the-pants jurisprudence, single-handedly kept the court close to the American mainstream, particularly on matters like reproductive freedom and affirmative action." And this is, I held elective office way back years ago. It's kind of an interesting point. O'Connor was the last justice to have ever held an elective office. A little bit of history this aside. She was twice elected to the Arizona State Senate after first being appointed by the governor. Most people may not know this, but she's a Texan. Born in El Paso, 1946. She grew up and she graduated from Austin High School in El Paso. She grew up on a cattle ranch near Duncan, Arizona, and she and her brother wrote a book entitled Lazy Bee, Growing Up on a Cattle Ranch in the American West. And if you're in a book club, it's a book worth reading. To keep faith with my original lamp assignment, and I was told what to do, and this is why I'm not reading because I'm following their directions. Here is a comment on the unsuccessful nominations. As of 1910, 150 people had been nominated for the court, and 29 nominees, including 1 nominated for promotion, had been unsuccessful on at least the first try. The 1968 LBJ episode of Abe Fortas and Homer Thornberry demonstrates just how dramatically politics and appointments to the Supreme Court are joined at the hip. In June of 1968, Chief Justice Earl Warren informed President Johnson that he planned to retire from the Supreme Court. Warren was concerned that Richard Nixon might win the presidency later that year and get to choose his successor. President Johnson shared Warren's concerns about Nixon and welcomed the opportunity to make his 3rd appointment to the court. He nominated his long-time confidant, Associate Justice Abe Fortas. And I've added this, and it's great history. Abe Fortas, who was a drinking and poker playing buddy of Johnson. Almost every week they drank together and played poker together. Johnson knew that several senators would be concerned about some of Fortas's liberal opinions, so he simultaneously declared his intention to fill the Fortas vacancy with the appeals court judge Homer Thornberry from Texas. The president believed that this because Thornberry was a conservative Texan, it would mollify the skeptical Southern senators. Johnson was the master of counting votes in the United States Senate. He concluded that despite warnings of a filibuster, he just barely had enough support to confirm Fortas. He was encouraged that his former Senate mentor, Richard Russell from Georgia, and Republican minority leader Everett Dirksen indicated that they would support Fortas because they had great respect for his legal brilliance. here's another place where politics enters into. The president soon lost Richard Russell's support. Why did he lose it? Because of the nominating, Richard Russell had a candidate he wanted to be appointed to the federal judgeship in Georgia, and they kept dragging their feet, and it didn't happen. So Russell said, "To hell with you, I'm not going to vote for your candidate for the Supreme Court." Crazy world. And Johnson urged the Senate leaders to waste no time in convening the Fortas confirmation hearing. He responded to staff assurances of Dirkson's support, continued support, and this is a quote from one of the books somewhere. Lyndon Johnson told an aide, and this is a quote, "Just take my word for it. I know Dirkson. I know the Senate. If they get this thing dragged out very long, we're going to get beat. Dirkson will leave us," and he did. Fortas became the first sitting associate justice nominated for Supreme Court Chief Justice, to testify in his own confirmation hearing. Those hearings reinforced what other senators already knew. And just think about this as I read it. As a sitting justice, Fortas regularly attended White House staff meetings. He briefed the president on secret court deliberations. And on behalf of the president, he pressured senators who opposed the war in Vietnam. When the Judiciary Committee revealed that Fortas had received a privately funded stipend equivalent to 40% of his court salary to teach an American university summer course, Dirkson and others withdrew their support. And although the committee recommended confirmation, for consideration sparked a filibuster, which brings up things from today. On October the 1st of '68, the Senate failed to invoke cloture. Johnson then withdrew the nomination, privately observing that if Johnson, had another term as president, quote, the Fortas appointment would have been different, but didn't go that way. There you have the best case study of the influence of politics on the Supreme Court. As we spend a few minutes on politics in the court, I should introduce the topic as my lanky 6'5" mentor, Charles Allen Wright, did in 1957 in our con law class, when he pompously, and I say pompously, announced his arrival to our con law class by wearing loafers with taps. He clicked in with long strides, tapping all the way, tap, tap, tap. He took the folding chair by the desk at the front of the room, sat on the side. He placed his well-polished shoes on the desk. He had white socks, and he had them on the desk. And we were all sitting there petrified. And without a word of introduction, without any telling us what we're doing or what he was going to do, he bellowed, "Hughes, Marbury versus Madison." I was terrified. It was my first meeting with Charles Allen Wright. Benny Hughes already had a CPA degree, and he made the highest grade on our first law school exam. He would later become the Grand Chancellor and editor of the Law Review. He immediately gave his take on Marbury versus Madison, and then spent almost half an hour jousting with Professor Wright. But it was also my introduction to one of the most significant periods during the history of the court, the tenure of Chief Justice John Marshall from 1801 to 1835. Marbury versus Madison is a landmark case that held that the Supreme Court could overturn a law passed by Congress if it violated the Constitution, and it legally cemented the power of judicial review. For many other cases, Marshall took a broad view of the powers of the federal government. The Marshall Court also held that the Bill of Rights restricted the federal government alone and did not apply to the states. Later courts would hold that the 14th Amendment, passed after the Civil War, had the effect to apply most of the provision of the Bill of Rights to the states. And many scholars of the court often referred as John Marshall as the great Chief Justice, and that's the way he's referred to. If there's anything sinister or wrong about the system whereby every president naturally tries to appoint justices who slant toward the big problems of government, follows and fits with the appointing president's slant, the wrongness does not lie in the fact that justices are still men and women, and that they are still themselves. The wrongness lies, and this is Rodell and Charles Allen Wright, lies rather in the fact that these justices, remaining themselves, attaining the power of justices, and retaining that power for sometimes over 30 years, inevitably they act as a check, a lag on the forward momentum of government, and on the way that a democracy directs national policy by electing officials who are perpetually responsible to the voters for what they do or don't do. Especially in times of crisis and change, a reluctant and backward-looking Supreme Court, dominated by justices who may owe their power to a reputed president or party, can create at least friction and at most chaos in the running of the nation. And here are just a few examples. The Marshall Court, all of whom were Federalists, slowed down the operations of Andrew Jackson's popular administration 30-odd years later, and after John Adams had appointed Marshall Chief Justice, so 30 years later they were making actions that reflected back that long. Roger Taney, the pro-Southern court, handed down the fateful Dred Scott decision that ruled that members of the African race were not and could never become citizens of the United States. Almost all scholars believe that decision helped bring on the Civil War. The Dred Scott decision was handed down 20 years after Andrew Jackson appointed Taney as Chief Justice. And probably the most noted example was in the 1930s, when the Four Horsemen of the Old Deal brought the court and its institution to one of its lowest ebbs and greatest crises when, quote, and these are again the materials, it flouted the nation's voters by vetoing much of Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. In each of these instances, as so many often in our history, a majority of the justices were behind the political times. So just a little evaluation. In a sense, it is inevitable that the court should be a brake on the rest of our machinery of government. By the very nature of the way it works, the court, for all the power its members hold, is only a negative. It's never an affirmative. It's never an affirmative force. It cannot create, it cannot initiate, it cannot put into action any government policy of any kind. All the justices can do is to approve or disapprove after they're asked to do so. The law passed by a legislature, an order given by an executive, a ruling made by a commission, an effort made by a law enforcing official to find somebody or put someone in jail. Until Lamp gave me this assignment, I had not understood an answer I gave when I was a state senator to a question from the audience. I was in a town in which every road in and out had a billboard that said, "Impeach Earl Warren." So it's a pretty conservative community. I thought my political career was over when I said that I did not support that goal because the Supreme Court, and this is what I said, is always going to be 20 years ahead or 20 years behind the popular will. And until September of 2016, I did not know that answer grew from the seed planted by Charles Allen Wright and Fred Rodell in 1958. And here is how their book, Nine Men, ends. O'Shaughnessy, the Irish poet, once sang, For each age is a dream that is dying, or one that is coming to birth. Over what was then 165 years, through age after different age, the justices of the Supreme Court have attended the birth and the death of different dreams. And an affirmation of faith in the bravest dream of all, the way the book ends, the American dream of freedom. Just at the very end, two experiences late in 2016 shaped my political observations for these last few minutes. Nell Delaney, who was the wife of the longtime Democratic Speaker of the Texas House of Representatives, was buried in the state cemetery just a few months ago. The first speaker at her grave ceremony was Laura Bush, wife of George W. Bush, former governor and president of the United States. Laura Bush started her remarks this way. When George became governor, the Lanneys and the Bushes became close friends. We were Republicans and the Lanneys were Democrats. But more importantly, we were Texans. During George W.'s time as governor, the Lanneys and the Bushes worked together for public policy. This is still Laura Bush's quote. Public policy that was nonpartisan, but was good for Texas. In my judgment, that is the recipe for all government, work for the good of the people. The second recent experience is a talk by an old friend of mine, Sandy Levinson, who is a genuine constitutional scholar at the University of Texas School of Law. Sandy said that the Supreme Court was not the most important issue in the upcoming presidential election. It was the election of people who had the power without court approval to make changes that would make our democracy work better. The two issues that he talked about were to eliminate the filibuster in the U.S. Senate and to reform the way that we draw political districts. Let me briefly describe each one as I do, and as I do, I would remind you of Disraeli's warning to all of us years ago, and this is his quote, "Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely." Both political parties, and these were my words from like 5 years ago, both political parties are guilty of not making changes that they have the power to make. When they have it, neither wants to relinquish the power. It will be an uphill battle to make the changes that Sandy Levinson talked about. Let me just briefly on filibuster and closure. My initial reaction was to agree with each suggestion, but upon reflection, I am agnostic on filibuster. It is the time when an effort is made to hold the Senate floor, and this is the old filibuster, where one person stands up and talks till they have to sit down, in order to prevent a vote or a bill or a confirmation. In 1917, the U.S. Senate adopted a rule at the urging of President Woodrow Wilson that allowed the Senate to end debate with a 2/3 majority vote. In 1975, the Senate reduced the number of votes required for closure from 2/3 to 3/5. That would be 60 votes, which it is today. This is the impasse that was so much in the news in regard to President Obama's nomination to the Supreme Court of Merrick Garland. When I first gave these remarks, there were not 60 votes for Judge Garland. My first inclination was to say eliminating the filibuster is a good thing, until I recalled my Texas Senate colleague, the ultra-liberal and the only Jew in the Senate at that time, who reminded the Texas Senate why it was an important tool. Another ultra-liberal, Senator Oscar Mosey of Dallas, did not like the filibuster, and so he was proposing a rule to limit the filibuster to no more than 24 hours. Babe Schwartz was making his speech in opposition, and these are Babe's words. I wrote them down at the time and kept them. He says, "I really disagree with the distinguished senator from Dallas, But on this issue, he is just wrong. He does not know what it is to be a minority. My good friend Senator is a WASU. I didn't know what a WASU was. He is a white Anglo-Saxon Unitarian. One other personal experience that gives me pause is the issue of the Rule of 11 in the Texas Senate. Out of 31 state senators, to bring a bill up in my time in regular order required a 2/3 vote. It was often a roadblock, but on important issues, most of the time, it could be resolved. Many issues that were blocked returned 2 years later and were much improved. What I call the art of governing, which is, I believe in the art of governing, is compromise, was reached. 2 or 3 opposing sides got some, but not all of what they expected. In a diverse society, the system works when all of the parties are willing to give a little, give up a little, to lose a little, and then come to a mutual agreement. I had to recall Jimmy Stewart in his role, Senator Jefferson Smith, in Frank Capra's film, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, where he talked and talked to the end. And then an old Southerner, J. Strong Thurman, who filibustered for 24 hours and 18 minutes against the Civil Rights Act in 657. And I've asked myself, what if I were in a minority? I don't know, but I just raise the issue because Sandy Levinson points out that a change in that one does not require a Supreme Court decision. It only requires a majority of the 100 votes in the Senate. Another issue, very quickly, and I think I will be okay. Citizens United. The Citizens United ruling was released in January of 2010. It essentially tossed out the long-standing ban on corporations and unions making independent expenditures and financing electioneering communications. It gave corporations and unions the green light to spend unlimited sums on ads and other political tools calling for the election or defeat of individual candidates. In a nutshell, the High Court's 5-4 decision was that it is okay for corporations and labor unions to spend as much as they want to convince people to vote for or against a candidate. That decision was later, and a later court decision based on Citizens United, led to the creation of super political action committees, which many people now would say to, they're acting as the shadow political parties for both Democrats and Republicans. That this one decision was the driving force behind the unexpected, and think about this is 216, the unexpected support for Senator Bernie Sanders in the Democratic primary, because it is such a huge issue among millennials today. In my personal opinion, and I'm very pictured to say this, neither a corporation, a labor union, or a super PAC is a citizen and should not be treated as one for campaign contributions.
I agree.
Yeah.
So just toward the end here, it took 5 amendments and 100 years to end voter discrimination. Women and African Americans were not allowed to step into a voting booth for almost 80 years. It wasn't until 1869, when the 15th Amendment was ratified, that males of all races got to vote. And I do emphasize, it did not give women the right to vote. It took another 50 years for women to finally get suffrage when the 19th Amendment was passed and finally it became law in 1919. The 24th Amendment became law in January of '64. It banned poll taxes, the tax imposed for the right to vote. Some states, including Texas, used the poll tax to chase ethnic and poor people away from the ballot box. And finally, during the bitter years of the Vietnam War, Americans realized that if young people can be ordered to fight and die for their country, they deserve the right to choose their leaders. And so the 26th Amendment lowered the voting age to 18 years. President Nixon signed it after Congress in the states passed and ratified it in 1971. And here, Vicki, if I know how to do this, I'm going to turn over here. The most egregious vehicle to discourage voters, and which in my judgment is the bedrock for much of the discontent among millennials and other citizens who feel that they're not being heard by their elected officials, is the way that districts are drawn from those officials who are closest to the people, members of Congress, state senators and representatives, and city councils. Here is gerrymandering in its most basic form. If you had 50 people, there are 3 different ways to draw the districts. If you drew number 1, it would represent them exactly as they are. If you did compact ones, the reds would be completely left out. And number 3 is a gerrymandered one, even though there are 60% of them are blue and the other white are red, that would completely shift it to 3 red districts and 2 blue districts. Contrary to one popular misconception about the practice, the point of gerrymandering is not to draw yourself a collection of overwhelmingly safe seats. Rather, it's to give your opponents a small number of safe seats while drawing yourself a larger number of seats that are not quite as safe, but that you can expect to win comfortably. And I have 5 examples. Some Democrats drawn, the D means they were drawn by Democrats, the R means they were drawn by Republican legislatures. This is in Maryland, and it was a district designed to preserve the seat of John Sarbanes, who was a very powerful Democrat, and you see it runs almost across the whole state. And this is based on the 2010 census. This is Lloyd Nogget's district here in Texas, and it was designed to allow Lloyd to get elected and to take away from others. And here's what it looks like on a map. It goes from Austin to San Marcos to New Braunfels to San Antonio, and then south of San Antonio. This is drawn by Republican legislature, or to keep a Republican, to keep him in office, and it was up in the area north of Dallas. And there it is on the map. Dallas, Grand Prairie, Arlington, all in that district that runs all the crazy way. This was drawn by Democrats to keep a Democrat in office in the state of Illinois. This is a vacant seat, but it's called, I'll let you read it, Goofy Kicking Donald Duck. And it goes from Reading to Coatesville to Pennsylvania to Lansdale and Pennsylvania. Unbelievably crazy, crazy district. And this is my old state senatorial district today. When I was elected, if you drew a line straight across, it was the top 20 counties. Very compact, all together, and now you can see it stretches down. It avoids Lubbock and just takes the most western part for several counties and goes down and picks up Midland and Odessa. And I believe at that point I need to move my notes here, and I'm right at the about end, and you guys will be able to, if you have a question, I'll probably can't answer it, but I'll, okay, let's see right here. Okay, but let's not be too critical of our current legislators. Partisan gerrymandering has a long tradition in the United States that precedes the 1789 election of the first Congress. In 1788, Patrick Henry and his anti-federalist allies were in control of the Virginia House of Delegates. They drew the boundaries of Virginia's 5th Congressional District in what proved to be an unsuccessful attempt to keep James Madison from being elected. So it goes back a long way. And because gerrymandering is so firmly entrenched in our political system, it will be very difficult to change. Voters should put drawing up fair, sane political districts on their agenda and hold candidates accountable for eventually making it happen. A goal for both political parties should be to make it easier for people to vote, cure voter fatigue by reducing the number of elections and the number of offices for which we vote. A good example are appellate judges. In Houston, Harris County, voters have to vote on about 150 different judicial slots, and most voters do not know who those people are. And in conclusion, it is fundamental, and here is a classic definition of democracy. It is a form of government in which people choose leaders by voting. Both political parties, Democrats and Republicans, engage in what I refer to as schoolyard term cheating, political cheating. They do not trust the people. And so now I want to show you two maps to show what voters can do when they get their dander up. 1972, the election, Richard Nixon and George McGovern. Except for down in the valley, McGovern carried only one county in the rest of the state of Texas, and that was Paducah, where an old, strong Democrat lived and delivered his county, but the rest of the state said, no, 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 we don't want to go there. And then Lyndon Johnson, back in 1964, was running, and he expected to carry almost the full state. He failed to carry 16 counties. Unfortunately, 7 of them happened to be in my own senatorial district up in the Panhandle, and as you will see if you read them down, 2 weeks after President Johnson became president, he entered an executive order to close the Amarillo Air Force Base and started the process that he was going to get even with that part of the country for not giving him the political support that he expected. Let me just add a personal note to the 1972 election. Had it not been for the Sharpstown Bank scandal, where after that we elected a new governor, a new lieutenant governor, a new attorney general. 16 of the 31 state senators were new. 78 of the 150 House members were new, brand new people. And I was only into my second session in the Senate. I would have never, ever been asked to be chairman of the Natural Resources Committee, which basically had the Texas economy in its hand. And I would not have moved up so rapidly in the seniority of the Senate had it not been for the Sharpstown Bank scandal. So in many ways, I'm one of the beneficiaries of it, because I wasn't there when it all happened, and it changed everything. So I have a line, I owe my political career to the Sharpstown Bank scandal. Let me conclude, as my wife Jean Alice concluded her 1976 bicentennial letter to our family and friends. It's a quotation from one of the most distinguished federal judges, Judge Learned Hand from the Second Circuit. On May 21st, 1944, he addressed several thousand newly naturalized citizens in Central Park, New York, at the annual I Am an American Day. He stated that all Americans were immigrants who had come to America in search of liberty. And here is how he concluded his remarks. Liberty lies in the hearts of men and women. When it dies there, no constitution, no law, no court can save it. No constitution, no law can even do much to help it. The spirit of liberty is the spirit which is not too sure that it is right. The spirit of liberty is the spirit which seeks to understand the minds of other men and women. The spirit of liberty remembers that not even a sparrow falls to earth unheeded. The spirit of liberty is the spirit of Him who near 2,000 years ago taught mankind that lesson it has never learned, but is never quite forgotten, that there may be a kingdom where the least shall be heard and considered side by side with the greatest. Jean Alice concluded her bicentennial letter this way: problems in government often seem so big, and we as individuals seem so small. But our greatest enemy is probably indifference of spirit. Dr. Carlisle Marney spoke to this when he addressed the convocation of worship and prayer that preceded the 1974 Texas Constitutional Convention. He said, "We are a sovereign people with the power to make hope come closer." So I now conclude by quoting my wife and Dr. Marney. We are a sovereign people with the power to make hope come closer. And as we used to say in the Texas Senate, I now yield the floor.
Oh,
50 minutes, so that wasn't quite an hour. So I now have glasses and I can see the audience, so I will put this up. I don't know that I could answer any questions, but I would be glad if anyone wants to